Alright, hello people. It is time for part 2 of John Stoltenberg's Refusing to be a Man. Looks like a few people are waiting, so about the same as last time. Alright, so just to kind of catch us up, this book is a series of essays that are kind of put together into various parts. And in the first part, he laid a lot of the kind of more abstract foundation for what his argument is. And in this part, we're actually going to see him try to apply it in some very interesting ways. Let me see, is this? Okay, it looks like we're good. And normally the way that you might refute an argument when someone's making all these like big abstract sort of claims is to apply it to reality and then say, okay, if your theory is true, this is what it's going to mean in practice, right? But for him, we actually don't even have to bother because he's going to do that for us. And particularly in the first part of this article, or in this, should I say, the first essay of this part, I should say, he sets up some extremely wonky shit. So he laid a foundation for arguing that basically the whole sexual binary, this myth, so-called myth of sex difference, well, he thinks this is male supremacy. And he thinks that if you believe that there's some kind of a difference between male and female that's fundamental, and that it's not like a perfectly evenly distributed spectrum, then you're reinforcing male supremacy. And it's all based in a phallocentric conspiracy in order to essentially create and perpetuate male sexual identity. So what's really fascinating about this series of essays is that, like, if you talk to most people and you have a conversation about like nature versus nurture, typically people will take some kind of a hybridized position, right? They'll argue, yeah, of course there are some innate tendencies. However, maybe society has an influence, right? Like they'll do a couple of eggs in one basket, a couple of eggs in the other. And a lot of people in the manosphere are criticized because a lot of our explanations for the way men and women are and their behaviors is based in evolutionary psychology, right? Where we go back, thousands and thousands of years, and then we start with this observation about the female eggs being the limiting factor in reproduction, and the male sperm being so infinite in supply that this kind of eventually trickles down, eventually translates into male disposability and female hypergamy, right? And we're criticized for saying, oh, that's so reductionist, that's so like ludicrous or whatever. But what he has here is like the opposite version of an explanation, which is he's going to do the same thing of like going back in time to ancient humans, but instead of basing his entire theory on something that's just like clearly observably true in humans, which is the difference between the supply of eggs versus sperm, instead it's like a bullshit reverse like engineering of the psychology of ancient males, and then from that arguing that was what created society and the different social expectations, and that this then reinforced itself across all of time and then replicated itself in every single culture. Like so this is so it's fucking bonkers. And like the way he then tries to explain the way male sexual identity is created off of this style of thinking and the style of an explanation, it's fascinating and completely fucking ridiculous. Hey Paulo, you wrote, let's see. So sex difference are false because scientists discovered it. So his argument is that if you take any objective definition for sex differences, you can find exceptions to these rules occurring in nature. And that much is true, right? And it's essentially the argument that, well, a few babies are born intersex, therefore male and female are just social constructs and they're not real. And that all of the clusters of physical objective things that we observe in the clusters of male and the clusters of female, that these are all arbitrary associations because there's so many exceptions. And again, it's something that it's not technically inaccurate that there are exceptions. The problem is that the exceptions don't disprove the rule, they in fact prove the rule. And the argument that all of this has to be socially and psychologically reinforced, otherwise it just wouldn't exist, it's fucking preposterous. But so in the first essay, let me see where to start here. One thing I want to note again is he's a gay man, right? And he's going to be using his own personal experience to draw from in order to psychologize and to theorize about how male sexual identity works. And I'm not going to say that, like, gay men aren't men, but I will say that if you're a gay man, you understand that your sexual identity, it's not typical, right? It's atypical. And he doesn't seem to really acknowledge this at all. He almost acknowledges it in the final essay here. But in terms of defining the origin of male sexual identity, there's nothing in there. And in fact, he doesn't explain homosexuality at all, which is kind of fascinating. You'd think that that would be one thing he'd want to offer some sort of explanation for. And he talks about sexual orientation as being part of this whole structure at the end of it. But in terms of the actual fundamental argument for how male sexual identity comes to be, there's no treatment of that whatsoever. So let me see. Like, you'll see it right here at top of page 50. He says, one remarkable aspect of father right is the quantity of violence required to enforce it, the quantity of violence required to perpetuate it, to keep it the form in which humans live out their lives, the air they breathe so long as they inhale and exhale. So, Terrence, I assume he's gay because he's out. I don't... Sometimes your sarcasm is, like, too dry for me to pick up. But yeah, he's an out gay man. Also, he married Dworkin. That's, like, you can't... A straight man would never do that. that was clearly a fag-hag relationship. But, so when I state, though, that he believes that, like patriarchy and male identity and everything, that it's all socially constructed, I'm not straw-manning him. That's literally what he just said here. He thinks the entire thing is perpetuated through violence and through force. And if we just take a step back and, like, have two different explanations for things, one which is based in saying, okay, there are some innate differences or tendencies that people are born with that we could call a nature to them, or at least some sort of a tendency, and that this is the origin of how things kind of cascade outwards, versus the entire thing is top-down socially constructed. Like, it's so obvious which one Occam's razor favors here, right? Like, this is conspiratorial fucking garbage, even by, like conspiracy standards. It's... But, let me see. So he talks about notions of property, right? And his argument is that a woman doesn't have her own personhood unless she's married. And before she's married, the personhood is an extension of the father's right. And a lot of this whole tirade here, it's kind of a half-truth, right? And this is a classic feminist half-truth. No, Dworkin was not his beard, I don't think. I mean, they were out gay, and it was, like, a constant thing that they talked about. Like they'd be, like, talked about it, interviewed of it, like, over decades. And regardless, he's not... He's out now, you know. It's no secret. Also, you can see an interview... You can see him... He has a YouTube channel where you can see him talk on the stage. He's clearly, like, gay affected. Like, it's... But anyway, so I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah. So this classic thing in feminism where they'll take the patriarchal privilege, right, and they won't ever give any treatment or acknowledgement to the other side of the coin, which is that this came with the responsibility. And what's fascinating is later on in this essay, when he's talking about how divorced women were required to remain celibate if they wanted to receive like child support from the men that they divorced, he thinks this is like a great injustice, but it just goes without saying that the man is supposed to continue to support this woman who divorced him, right? And this is the pattern. We see it over and over again. So he's going to complain about how men owned women as property, yet there's absolutely no addressing and no treatment of the fact that this came with the responsibility of them. He argues that historically rape is seen as a crime against the father. Again, I really think he is painting this in like a ridiculous way, because the reason that the law is centered on men is that only men are held responsible for these things. And there's no way to have a fair treatment of that unless you're looking at both sides of it. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that whole thing. But that's the backdrop that he sets out in like the first few pages here, is that this is all based in father right and in a phallocentric notion of property. So let's see, we're going to go a little bit further down. He complains about the way that child custody disputes are favoring men. He alludes to like certain advantages that women has, but then says, well, it's under attack right now. so therefore women most affected. So even when women are privileged, he can't acknowledge that, because the fact that women might lose that privilege is obviously male supremacist. This was an interesting little tidbit he had in here. He doesn't really expand upon it, but so the argument is that everything in culture, including religion, is designed to assert phallocentric dominance, right? And this tidbit was interesting. He wrote, the power of male ownership from the grave is still alive and well, of course, not only in patriarchal law and Judeo-Christian religious tradition, but also in personal psychological identity. Let me see. No, I don't want to read this Juliet Mitchell quote. There was a bit about, he criticized, anyway, all it was he criticized Christianity as deifying the son and Judaism as deifying the father. Which is, again, a little bit ridiculous, because, there's no treatment of the matrilineal tracing within Judaism, which would seem to go against this narrative, nor any treatment of, the Virgin Mother Mary and all of that, which, again, would seem to be a deification of the feminine. But no, fuck it. It's just a classic case of just kind of cherry-picking, seeing things one way. I think I went past it, but there's a section in here where he argues that, he acknowledges that the reason you would have marriage is to help give the father an assurance of his paternity, right? Is that under a marriage system, since females are biologically guaranteed that they know it's their child, right? That this gives a way for men to have some sort of reassurance, right? And he acknowledges this, right? He acknowledges this, but just sweeps it away and says, actually, no, this is not the reason, because there's so many other things in place that clearly it's just about domination and subordination of women. So, again, this happens frequently. He gets so close to acknowledging what the actual truth is, and then has to immediately psychologically explain it away. And that's really kind of the story of these entire essays, where he's so close to having alternative explanations that are a lot simpler and make a lot more sense, but because he has absolutely no empathy for males at all, and absolutely no interest in understanding the other side of this entire discussion, he can't see it in any other way, and he has to come out ahead of his own observations and repackage everything in order to justify his insane fucking narrative. And, at no point does he take a step back and say, wait a minute, my insane social constructivist, top-down conspiratorial, anti-male narrative Like if all these things have to be true in order for it to make sense, maybe I've made some fundamentally stupid assumptions and I should check those. No, instead he just like goes full into it because he can't be wrong about this. And the reason I think it's important to go over this is because like people who are kind of dumb, this is well written enough and uses enough big fancy words that people will pick it up and they'll think, oh wow, this guy sounds so smart, and some of this kind of sounds like it makes sense, and the grammar and the syntax was logical, and therefore he must be right. or maybe people they are smart enough to see past this, but maybe they just don't have the energy, and so it's very like this propaganda can be very harmful. And I think a lot of people will pick this up and they'll read it and they'll know something's off, but they won't be able to put a pin in it. So it needs to be gone through, and honestly, it needs a treatment that's a little bit casual and irreverent, because I think people need to realize you don't need to step into this like fake, sophistic academic style of speaking in order to deconstruct this kinds of bullshit. Anyway, let me just go a little bit further into this. Okay, here's an important part. Under Father Right, the first fact of every human life is that one is birthed by human flesh that belongs to someone barren. So he's setting up an entire narrative where, because property was based in Father Right, personhood is based in male sexual identity. And therefore, so women, they don't have personal identity unless it is through the male. And this is where we get to the idea that, actually, is this the second essay where he talks about fetuses? I think the second one is all about fetuses. Wait, no, that was about war. Sorry, let me just run through. Okay, so the third essay is about fetuses. For some reason, the third essay seems to tie into the first one really well. I just want to make sure that I'm addressing them somewhat in order. Okay, this was the part I didn't want to miss. Okay, this is it. So this is the point where he literally argues that male sexual identity, that its origin is in domestic violence. And that's not a straw man. That's literally what he's going to argue. So, the argument is that men are reproducing through women who are barren, and the idea is that child is going to be male. And that men will, they'll wish this and even psychologically assume it, up until the very moment when it happens to be female, right? And the idea is that the existence of the male baby, it's contrary to masculine identity, right? Because like babies are like, they can't do anything, right? And they're soft, they're fragile, right? And that in the early age of nurturing, right, this baby is just like with the mother all the time, and it's perceived as feminine, and this causes some kind of psychological dissonance, and he believes that this causes rage on the part of the father. So I just want to find exactly how he states it. Yes, the father's struggle to repossess the son will be played out in front of the boy's uncomprehending eyes and upon the bodies of both the boy and the mother. Of course, the father will be aided and abetted by schools, television, and other cultural accessories to the theft of sons from mothers. But the father figure in the flesh will succeed in dividing the boy's eroticism against the mother only by physical and emotional brutality. The boy will be a witness as the father abuses his wife, once or 100 times. It only needs to happen once. But see, that's the key. It needs to happen once. And I don't see any explanation in here for how a person ends up with a male sexual identity if there isn't domestic violence. So he seems to be taking it as a necessity. All male sexual identity comes from domestic violence. It has to happen at least once. Like, So let's see. Only needs to happen once, and the boy will be filled with fear and helpless to intercede. Then the father will visit his anger upon the boy himself, uncontrollable rage, wrath that seems to come from nowhere, punishment out of proportion to any infraction of any rules the boy knew existed. Once or 100 times, it only needs to happen once, and the boy will wonder in agony why the mother did not prevent it. From that point onward, the boy's trust in the mother decays, and the son will belong to the father for the rest of his natural life. Now, one interesting aside here, this is yet another example of how he employs, it's a combination of course, male hyper-agency and female hypo-agency. The question, why doesn't the mother protect the child? That's actually a fair question, right, in this scenario. That, especially in modern societies, right? Like in modern societies where women have all of these options for leaving these kinds of situations that are abusive, where women are, they have astronomically higher sexual market value and therefore much more responsibility in choosing their partner than males do. There's no question here. Like, that's actually a legitimate concern. Maybe this was less true 50 years ago. I don't know. I mean, this wasn't even written 50 years ago. This was written like 40 years ago, 30 years ago, something like that. But anyway. So he writes, "It is a pity. The son could have learned from the mother the eroticism of mothering. The son could have learned to feel with, to care for, to cherish other lives. The son could have learned to mother the mother. Instead, the son betrays her." So this is the situation he's spelled out. You have a young, like this could be like a toddler. This could be like a 4-year-old little boy, and he's characterizing that boy's psychological response to domestic violence as him betraying the mother who failed to protect him. Okay, let me just address the chat here. Christianity is Judaism. Paulo, I agree. What is female sexual identity based on then? Being a victim of patriarchy? Yeah, good question. Apparently, female sexual identity is the act of caring and loving others and cherishing other lives. Apparently that's distinctly feminine, and I have no idea. I have no idea where the fuck that comes from, right? And the other thing too is like, if the child, all things being the same, is a daughter, why doesn't the daughter then learn the same lessons that he's saying that the son is learning in this context? Because there's no particular reason that this is directed at the son, because he's saying that the first target was the mother. And in theory, if the mother births a daughter, this would actually make the father more angry, right? Under this kind of bullshit psychologizing. Like, I don't see why that wouldn't be the argument either. So yeah, he's gendered so many things about the parent-child relationship in order to create this delicate argument, and like you can change any variable, and then we're sitting here like, well, how is any of this explained? I don't know. We don't fucking know. he's got an agenda. Hey, work boot, nice to see ya. Doesn't he acknowledge that his father was abusive? How did he not end up with a stereotypical male sexual identity? See, and that's an interesting point too, because I feel like it's unfalsifiable, because what he can argue is, yeah, this is based in my experience, and I have a male sexual identity because my father was abusive, in which case he's just projecting his own experience onto, he's just kind of projecting his own experience onto everyone else, and it's like, why are we going to assume that your experience is typical? On the flip side, he can argue, well, my father didn't beat me, and that's why I'm a homo, right? So I feel like it doesn't matter. This isn't based in anything. He just knows what his conclusion is, and he's just doing bullshit sophistic dances in order to justify it after the fact. I kind of want to write like a parody of this. Where I do the same kind of psychologist, because I think it would be really cathartic to make something that's like equally like scathing and unfair, criticizing and psychologizing women. like a Bash a Violent Bitch Month article, but literally like this entire 200 fucking page book. I don't know. Would that be worth it? It'd be funny. I'd enjoy it maybe. Terrence says, I don't know if this sort of writing is meant to be persuasive to normies. It's going to largely appeal to people who experienced certain types of trauma. Yeah, I can see that. I mean, it's kind of like a Mott and Bailey thing. These are like insane Bailey-style arguments, right, that kind of get thrown out there, and they're provocative. I think it appeals to a lot of females because they don't have the experience of being male. So when this degenerate, insane homosexual comes out here saying this is the nature of male sexual identity, and these women already believe in kind of like level 1 starter feminist style arguments about patriarchy, you know, then they think, oh wow, this was really deep and really enlightening. And I think that it kind of you know, it's basically the inverse of what I do, right? Where I say I want to make the claims more radical and push it to the absolute most extreme stance that I can possibly justify, because even if people won't believe what I say, it's going to ultimately push them further down the Overton window than they would have been otherwise, because I've given them all this ground where they can take like 80% of what I said or 70% of what I said. Whereas if you try to make all of your claims like perfectly fair and balanced with every single thing, people are still going to find reasons to nitpick, and ultimately you're just going to end up not taking them as far as you could have. And I think that's the same thing in play here. He's making his claims as hardline and insane as he possibly can, because even if people don't buy into this 100%, they're going to look at this and they're going to say, oh, yeah, this is, you know, I don't believe in the 100% social constructivist narrative, but maybe this is 80% of the way there, right? Like, I think that's what's happening here. Hey, Thuggy, nice to see you. Thuggy, I'm a wrench you. Let me give you a wrench. My wrench no state. Boop. By the way, Terrence, did you get a new account or something? I think, because I feel like I gave you a wrench twice. I don't know. Anyway. But anyway, so now we're at, this is like the fucking crazy part. So he faced this domestic violence situation, right? And he says, the authority of the anger of the father is interpreted by the son as follows. 1. Not mother hates mother, and not mother hates me. Not mother hates us. Number 2, it is because I am like mother that not mother hates me. 3, I should be different from mother. The more different I am from mother, the safer I will be. These are the cardinal principles of logic in male maturation under father right. They are so simple even a child can understand. They are backed up by the constant threat of the father's anger, so the child will remember them, and the child will never forget. So that's it. Like, that's... So when I say he thinks male sexual identity is based in domestic violence, is that not what he just said? Is that literally not what he just said? These are the cardinal laws that define male sexual identity. Is that the father abuses the mother and the son perceives that he is similar to mother, and that this is the reason for the abuse, and therefore as a reaction to that abuse tries to be as much unlike his mother as possible. And this is how this is how sexual male identity reproduces itself over time, is through domestic violence. Like, I'm just befuddled, just absolutely befuddled, and I don't see any acknowledgement of anything good about fathers here. He seems to literally think everything that is good and caring and nurturing comes from women. We don't know how the female sexual identity comes into existence. That just is good naturally, right? Apparently that's not socially constructed in any way. And then the male sexual identity, it's nothing but rape, domination, and wife beating. and that's the only thing that the father teaches his son, is how to be a rapist and a wife beater. That... Let me see, was there anything else in here? Consequences and conclusion. We live in a two-gender system in service to the father. There is no justice. There is no peace. That system is inappropriate to the memory of erotic communion with other life. In fear and in honor of the father, son learns to deny that memory, to rid their bodies of it. In fear and in honor of the father, son learns an identity isolated in the phallus. The father-son relationship is a monument to phallic identity, to the dying of the disembodied penis inside the vagina of a woman. So that refers to, in the heterosexual penis and vagina sex, he believes that men, they only exist as males when they're hard and when they're fucking things. So when a man is flaccid, he doesn't feel anything. He doesn't feel his sexual identity, because this male constructed sexual identity is strictly based in fucking. So when a man fucks a woman and comes inside her and pulls out a penis that then becomes flaccid, the psychological impact of that is that the erection, the actual physical existence of his sexual identity was deposited in the woman, right? And then therefore the son that's birthed later is seen as a continuation of that phallic identity. That's the overall argument in place here. Okay, let's go on to the next one. So this one, Disarmament and Masculinity. I'm going to confess, so on my BitChute, I have these 4 parts. I now have the 4th part up. And like this particular section is really difficult to listen to because it's all quotes. He opens up with just quotes from a bunch of women. Names we all know, like good old Mary Daly, Susan Brown Miller, Andrea Dworkin, obviously, Robin Morgan, just, you know, classic man-hating bigots. Let's see. I wonder how many of these we even care to read. The overall backdrop of this is the Vietnam War. By the way, shout out to Jay Willie. I am so drunk right now. Hey, that's good. You should be drunk for this. Does he say anything about fathers' relation to their daughters? No, not. I don't think anything in particular. Just except that it's disappointing. Like, he does, but nothing in that depth. Because we don't know how female sexual identity comes to exist under patriarchy. Besides, I guess, just through victimization. It's just like, it's kind of interesting because he gives this very active definition of the male sexual identity, and then I guess the female one we're just supposed to kind of passively infer. I don't recall hearing anything about that. But so anyway, so you have people protesting the Vietnam War, right? And all these feminists are sitting there playing this whataboutist game where they're like, oh, well, you're against war. When are you going to end the patriarchy? That's the real war, right? And that's literally their narrative, is they say, we're not going to march with you unless you also make this about women. And what's interesting about this essay is that, so he's gay, right? So for him, the idea that men go to war to protect and defend the women that they love, that doesn't even come into play. That's completely unacknowledged. There's no conception of males caring about and loving women at all. And instead, he sees war as homoerotic. He actually defines war. He says it's a homoerotic display between men. And if you think about it, if since he's gay and kind of an idiot, that's how he's going to see it. Because to him, the concept of loving and caring for and protecting women doesn't at all factor into it. So he doesn't acknowledge that as a motivation for war, that all these women who have the privilege of staying home and being protected and not being part of war, that doesn't even factor into it. War is just this arbitrary display that men just do, and if only they listened to women, we wouldn't have war anymore. Like, another fascinating thing, too, is So one thing that we see in anti-feminism, right, is that we constantly point out that when you break things down in terms of like male versus female privilege, is that there's essentially 2 classes of men, right? There's the elite men on top, And then you have all of the women who are, on average, far more privileged than the overwhelming majority of all the other men who would then be in like this second category, right? Is that instead of it being male privilege on top and then female on the bottom, it's a sandwich, right? And the sandwich is very uneven. The sandwich is like men are the bottom of the pyramid and all of the worst off people in society, basically. So, no, Terrence, he talks about having sex in the other parts too. He doesn't like penetrative sex because of the socio-political connotations of specific sex acts. But he does like some things about sex, he says. So he's not asexual. He's a gay man. I don't know why you can't accept this, Terrence. What's the deal? Why can't you accept that John Stoltenberg is gay? Is it just because, I don't know. I don't understand. I don't get it. She's like, no, a gay man can't possibly think this. But anyway, so what's interesting, right, is that the feminist narrative is that they say, well, patriarchy hurts men too. And this is another example of where he gets so close to acknowledging the problem. He gets so close to getting it, but like he can't take the last step. He characterizes military men as the super father, right? But he doesn't then take the next step to realize that, okay, so if under father right, the people who are owned or whatever are oppressed, if we have super fathers above the other fathers, right, are those fathers not also oppressed in that sense, right? And then, if this is like, I guess, the tacit source of female sexual identity, do these men then understand the female perspective in relation to the so-called superfathers, right? It's basically like you can throw out all of the counter examples to patriarchy conjecture and say, like, this is why it doesn't make sense, and then instead of acknowledging that the whole framework is stupid, he says, oh, no, there's two patriarchies, because there's a meta-patriarchy above the first patriarchy. And you can just do this ad nauseum, down to the individual level, such that I would argue a lot of women, right, would fall into this superfather role. Likewise, like... So anyway, an interesting thing that happens here, too, is, like, he refers to... It might be in the quotes, but there's all these references to women putting their bodies on the line. And at one point they even say, women... So during the war, when women are protesting, they say, women put their bodies on the line alongside men to protest the war. Right? And it's like, if the men and women are both protesting it together, why did you phrase it in that way? And it's another example of, like, if he'd noticed these things, he would see that his narrative is, like, that extremely thin, but he has to constantly dress it up in this cheap sophistry. So he has to word it in such a way as saying, women put their bodies on the line alongside the men. And this is in the context of men being sent off to war. And he's almost acknowledging that these men are victims, right? That these younger men who are sent off to war are victims of the so-called superfathers. But ultimately, he's arguing that it's all men who have to basically man up and make war not happen by just listening to women. I just like... this Abigail Adams quote. I cannot say that I think you very generous to the ladies, for whilst you are proclaiming peace and goodwill to men, emancipating all nations, you insist upon retaining an absolute power over wives. And it's like, okay, Abigail Adams writing that to John Adams in 1776. If you believe that women are oppressed, I'm sorry, that kind of uppity bitch, like, how is she not getting her ass kicked under patriarchy? Like, this is evidence of not enough patriarchy, in my opinion. Can you just imagine that fucking entitlement? Like, Jesus Christ. Like, just that quote is, like, everything you need to know about gender. It's like, here's John Adams trying to set up, like, trying to set up like a fucking new country, and Abigail Adams like, well, what about me? And it's like, go fuck yourself. What did the women do? You like made the ugliest fucking flag in all of the history of any nation, and like that's your contribution. Like sorry, whatever. This Dworkin quote is interesting. In the abolition movement, as in most movements for social change then as now, women were the committed. Women did the work that had to be done. Women were the backbone and muscle that supported the whole body. But when women made claims for their own rights, they were dismissed contemptuously, ridiculed, or told that their own struggle was self-indulgent, secondary to the real struggle. And it's like, what women stepped into were the roles that men were doing previously. So what's fascinating is that under, like in peacetime, these things that men are just assumed to have to do are somehow not essential, right? They're just like, oh, whatever. It's just that's just whatever. Then when men go off to war, often to protect women, that's at least the stated goal. I guess we're assuming no, it's actually just a homoerotic display, and there's no other motive to it whatsoever. We don't care about women, right? When women then fill the roles that men were doing previously, now suddenly that's the backbone and muscle that supports the whole body of society. And it's like you just like look at the two things, and it's like how do they not see that all of those roles and all those things that the women are doing now are the things men are doing previously? And if it's the backbone and whole of society at that point, why was it not beforehand when there was peace? Let me see. Yeah, this was the quote I was talking about. During the late 1950s and early 60s, women put their bodies on the line again in the movement against segregation and racial discrimination. So again, it's protest. Okay. Earlier, he used this exact same language and said alongside men. Yeah, they talk about, oh, the civil rights law guaranteed equal rights for black people, but what about women, right? And they didn't talk about women early enough, you know. Woman is the Negro of the world, etc. Just stupid shit. He talks about the ERA and opponents of it. This didn't age well. Was there anything else even in here? Now the nuclear arms race is a race. Sorry, nuclear arms race is a clear and present emergency, and in response to that emergency, there has been a growing national and international movement calling for disarmament. Let me see. I just want to talk about, like, the issue here is, he essentially argues that since male sexual identity is defined and characterized by threats of violence, this is what war is, and this is what nuclear arms are, is that nuclear missiles are a penis, and whichever country has the most nuclear arms has the biggest penis. And I guess that's not totally untrue. That kind of makes sense. But it's a one-sided half-truth style acknowledgement of it. It's like, oh, you want to have this just because you want the biggest cock, not because having that creates any kind of deterrent to people fucking with you, right? Like, that there's absolutely no acknowledgement of the role that men have in protecting women in any of this. It's literally a view of war that sees it as, like, nothing but a self-indulgence that's never had any purpose or necessity at any point ever. He quotes Soren Kierkegaard, paraphrasing the whole Abraham and Isaac story, which is, like, irrelevant. Let's see. Yeah, this was the part where he's almost getting it. This is the super father's notion of it. And again, he's just stating the same thing again. Look at, the young males refusing to fight, and this is such a great step, but they didn't take it far enough because they did not emancipate women, because that's the real war. When the superfathers of America speak of national security, they take for granted that the body rights of men extend to territorial rights and property rights over the bodies of women and children. Defending these body rights is the basis of all relations between groups of men. Under patriarchy, males learn in their own bodies to eroticize aggression, that is, their impulse to act in a way that owns, dominates, and violates another person's body rights, has been indelibly conditioned according to a cultural norm of how male eroticism is supposed to feel. Under patriarchy, normally acculturated males assume, correctly, that the same impulse to sexual violence exists in other males. They therefore endeavor to enter into homoerotic truces, non-aggression pacts, contracted between men who tacitly agree to aggress against others, women and sometimes weaker men, or men of other races, instead of one another. When a group of men shares power over their constituency of women, that sharing assuages their fears of one another's potential for aggression. In their hearts, men grow up terrified of giving offense to and being attacked by more violent males. Between men of different nations, armed, phallic, right? So armed means phallic. Armed deterrence against forcible violation of the territory they own, the country they own, is men's first line of defense against assault by other men. The military postures of patriarchal nations are modeled exactly on the psychosexual needs of men to defend themselves against personal assault by other men, which can be understood as eroticized violence between males exclusively, and therefore homosexual. So, I don't fully understand this, how he calls everything erotic. Right? He calls parent-child relationships, he calls them erotic, and now he's calling relations between men in war erotic. And I don't know, that seems pretty thin to me, right? But he sneaks the word erotic in there, so now he can call it homosexual. Which I don't know. Am I just a midwit? Is this too high IQ for me? This is some it's absolutely ludicrous. But again, this is an echoing of the same sort of thing he did when he was setting up father right and the way that this works with property, which is that he's not acknowledging any of the responsibilities that come with those rights. And when you look at it as just that half-truth, yeah, this is the way you're going to see it. So what's fascinating, though, is that it's taken for granted, right, that men are reacting to a potential of being transgressed by other males, right? So women don't deal with this in the same way. Or in theory, right? In theory, if women are constantly at threat of being violently raped by men, why doesn't this create a sort of warfare mentality in women, right? Like, why aren't women forming homoerotic structures of phallic self-defense against their patriarchal oppressors? I don't, or is that the explanation for like political lesbianism, right? Like, I don't, like, because this is the issue, is he even talks about other races, right? So is his argument that that the white race is the most masculine and has the biggest penis, and then if you're a non-white race, you're more feminized, like more in touch with the feminine sexual identity, and therefore more capable of love and care and concern and all of the good things in humanity, right? I feel like we're one step away from that argument that he put here, right? Because if these men of other races or weaker men are being subjected to the treatment that women are and being seen as property in the way that women are, how does their male sexual identity come into existence? Are only white males male? Right? And this is something we constantly see, is that because they use all of the same rhetoric to explain race relations as they do gendered relations, because they're fundamentally Marxists, like these wires, it's too easy to cross them, because they love any argument that says that anything pro-male is white supremacist and like vice versa, and that there's a synergy there. But then if we take the corollary to that argument, are we not also arguing that like minority cultures are feminized somehow? And if that's the case, well, I don't know, this kind of runs contrary to like observed phenomenon of like sexual characteristics of people of different races, right? Is that we seem to have like more sexual dimorphism among black races, right? Where like there's a bigger difference between their males and females, And then in Asians, you kind of see the opposite. And like, how does that factor into this explanation of, I guess, sexual identity being a completely socially constructed myth? Would we not see this also play out in a racial sense if apparently it's white people who are like the most prolific colonizers and like the most dominant display of this like horrible, ravenous, just rapist colonizing mentality? I don't know. I'm just asking the question because I see us, we're one step away from those arguments and those questions. And as I've gotten through the third part of this. I haven't listened to or read the fourth part yet. From what I saw though, that's not getting addressed. Let me see here. Which, you know, that's very intersectional of you, John. I guess intersectionality came into fashion a little bit later, so we'll give him a pass, I guess. Let's see. This country's superfathers want to make certain that the United States will have the biggest cock in the world. That is, the greatest potency for sadism, euphemistically referred to as deterrent capability. So, like, that's interesting too, right? Those concepts are so fundamentally different. Like typically with a euphemism, it's like the same kind of thing, right? But one of them has like a nicer value judgment. But like the implication behind deterrence is that you're not actively using it. And like, how is that sadistic? It's like if I have a home and I build a wall around my home to deter people, how is that sadistic? The wall is just sitting there. The only way that you could make that leap in logic is if you feel entitled to robbing me and murdering me, right? And like this is how these arms are functioning. Is that if you have that, then you're making a message that says, hey, you know, if it comes down to it, we have the capacity to defend ourselves, right? If you violate the NAP, we're gonna make it hard on you. We're going to react, potentially even disproportionately, because fuck you if you're the violator of the NAP, right? That's not sadistic. Like, if it's retaliation, I just think it's not. No. Anyway. But again, he used the word euphemistically, and that's how many syllables? Euphemistically. That's 5 syllables. That's 5 whole syllables, right? So if you're like either tired or dumb and you're reading through this, a lot of people are going to say, oh yeah, or like you're like an undergrad student. He used the word euphemistically. Yeah, deterrent does just mean sadism. Why not? It's all just a penis. It's all rape. Build a wall? That's rape. That's just raping the border with a wall. Why not? It's sadistic. Nuclear arms are an extension of male's potency for Satanism. Not Satanism, sadism. Nuclear arms are the capability for the ultimate masculinity confirming fuck. That capability fills the imagination of those who have it and those who don't. As cock power is reckoned, it is in lethality, the maximum threat that men can imagine wielding against one another. To the perceived as militarily weak is by definition to be feminized, vulnerable to attack. To be perceived as having the greatest potency for sadism, as men imagine, to be secure, hence the arms race and the obsession with the quantity of bombs prepared to be dropped. Yeah, and I suppose you could map this onto terms such as pussy slaying, right? Why are you slaying the pussy? It must be because this male sexual identity is based in conquest and domination. And what more perfect and sincere form of domination is there than slaying, right? And of course, to be vulnerable to attack, he's talking about a loose anus, right? He's talking about an anus that is, you know, loosened up, lubed up, and just ready to be penetrated. And that's feminization. So you see how fucking easy it is to just like arbitrarily package things into this? It's a goddamn cartoon. Let me see here. At present, the superfathers of the U.S. and the USSR are parties to a precarious, tenuous homoerotic truce, whereby the two supercocks endeavor to keep stockpiles of bombs, which is cock power. The cock power must be balanced. They agree not to aggress against each other's satellite nations, which is the male owners of which are themselves in homoerotic alliances with a supercock for protection. So again, the beta males are under the alphas, right? The alpha is the supercock, and they have a homoerotic alliance in order to, between the supercocks or with one or another supercock for protection. They agree to respect each other's right within their respective boundaries to aggress against racial and ethnic minorities, which, again, this is like, I don't know, maybe there's truth to this, right? Like if you imagine like war in Africa, when you have like the African ethnic minorities in other countries, like they purge them, right? But those are going to be a lot of black ethnic minorities within Africa. So I don't know, something South Africa, or what about all the wars between all the Asians? Like, are they all ethnic minorities to each other, even if there's more of the other party, right? Like, you see how this is like, I don't know. It's either like hashtag non-unique to the white people, but then also there's all these counterexamples of like people kill each other of their own race all the time. So I don't know. I guess I'm kind of at a dead end with that one. Then the last point he had here was agree to respect any and all national policies prescribing the subjugation of women to men. Anyway, we don't need to beat that dead horse that this so-called subjugation is half of the story, is that these women don't have the responsibilities that men have. Namely, they're not dying in war, right? Them putting their bodies on the line is either they do the work that men would otherwise do, or they go protest. Oh, you walked around with a sign. Like, at worst, the police like sicked a dog on you, or like got you with a hose or something. It's like whatever. Like, as bad as that can be, that's not war. That you're fine. Sorry, I like protesting is so gay. Like. That's the real homoerotic cock power arms race, is fucking protests. I don't know. There was some quote about white males that aged like really poorly. Let me see. That's too far down. Here we go. Oh yeah, it was one of the 𝒂𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧 quotes that I skipped. Okay, so this was the last bit of this that I want to highlight. 𝒂𝒧𝒧𝒧 writes, white males are most responsible for the destruction of human life and environment on the planet today. Yet who is controlling the supposed revolution to change all that? White males. It seems obvious that a legitimate revolution must be led by, made by, those who have been most oppressed. Black, brown, and white women, with men relating to that as best they can. So, now, to be charitable, this quote is probably from like the 60s, right? 60s or 70s or something. Didn't age well, right? Which countries pollute the most again? Oh yeah, it's China and India. So, I don't know, we're going to shake that equation up a little bit, right? I just thought that was really amusing. I also love how 𝒂𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧𝒧 here, and then like sneaking the white women in there. This is peak white feminism right here. Okay, sorry, I just had to highlight that because it was funny to me. Okay, so now we're getting into the fetus as penis, men's self-interest, and abortion rights. I'm gonna grab myself a beverage. It's literally I just can't reach it. But before I get into this, I'm gonna play for you an excerpt from part 3 of this. Just as a little bit of a teaser.
Cal's huge, lust-bloated member sliced viciously into her hotly clasping pussy, and every time his hot swollen ball slapped against her ass she let out a deep groan of unbearable pleasure. The language of sex that is forbidden used to be language like this. Bitch, he snapped, pulling away from her, yanking his dick out of her mouth. You're trying to make me come before I'm ready. You know I like to fuck your ass before I come. You inconsiderate bitch, he spat, knowing how she ate up that kind of talk. The language of sex that is forbidden used to be language like this. Take it, you cunt, take your punishment, he growled, whirling the whip around his head and cracking it down against my buttocks. You take your punishment, bitch, you take all of it, you slut. The whip lashed into my thighs and I screamed in the exquisite grip of agony as it burned me with a wonderful, almost fire-like passion.
Just... sorry, I'm like a child. I just think that's really funny. I think you guys heard that, right? I'm pretty sure the desktop audio is linked. But basically he thinks that like hardcore sadomasochistic like fucking romance novels and shit are like that's the defining characteristic of sex, basically. All right. That's from part 3. So that's what we'll be discussing next week. I don't even know where to go with that. There's a lot of interesting like legal shit in there, so I almost might not be qualified, but I'll try my best. But anyway, so now we're in the fetus as penis, men's self-interest and abortion rights. So this particular part of the audio, I completely fucked up because I used Control F to get rid of all the numbers because I wanted to get rid of all the page numbers, but it ended up taking all of the numbers out of everything. And like he cites a lot of statistics, and rather than writing out the numbers, he put the numeric numbers in there. So it just has like blanks where like there's no year or blanks where there's no percentage. And then at one point when I realized this, I tried to replace the numbers with like the pound sign because I thought that would be like he would say number, but then I realized he would just say like hashtag instead. So it sounds like even dumber. So my apologies to anybody who pulls up part 2 because it's a little bit hard to read, but whatever. I'll share this PDF in another form. But let me see here. I just need to just kind of skim through a little bit. In fact, history. Okay, this part's interesting. He wrote, he talks about this trope of men not expressing their feelings, but he says men have expressed their feelings about women, death, and absent fathers, and turned those feelings into religions. Men have expressed their feelings about women, wealth, possession, and territory, and turned those feelings into laws and nation states. So what you can see is like this essay here actually is very similar to the first one, which is why I feel like with the order of this, the second and third one should have been flipped because this almost feels like the same. Let me just see. And a lot of this one focuses on abortion. And essentially what he's arguing is that men are trying to dominate and control women having reproductive agency because men want women to do that role, obviously. They want to have male heirs. Men don't want to take responsibility for birth control. And men understand on like an existential level that if women were allowed to choose this, basically they would abort everything. And towards the end of this, his argument is that to some degree this is a psychological expression of the fear that had a man's own mother been given the choice, that she would have aborted him. Now, what's interesting is that this entire thing is gendered. He does talk about how in a lot of these surveys, women who choose to get abortions often decline because of religious reasons, right? But right out the gate, he's packaged all religion as patriarchal, and he's arguing that these religions are part of a system of patriarchal domination. So there's basically no way, in his view, for a woman to be pro-life, right? Because typically a woman who makes that position is going to make some kind of a religious argument. She doesn't have to. There's perfectly sound secular arguments in favor of the pro-life position. um, that's how he's constructing it. Is he's saying, oh well, if a woman is not pro-choice, it's because she's religious, and the religion is patriarchy. So it's always 1 or 2 degrees of separation away from female hypoagency and male hyperagency, as usual. Um, so that way he can gender the entire abortion issue, the entire idea that so the fact that abortion isn't completely legal, on demand, and paid for by the state. If it's not all of those things, then it's men controlling women's bodies. And it's a malicious thing that men are inflicting upon women because men have an existential fear, and they also extend their phallic identity into the fetus. And they psychologically perceive of all fetuses as being male by default. And that's it. It's that how dare these women murder the penis? Is that when a woman gets an abortion, it's akin to a castration. And like, I don't even know where to go with this. So he describes this when he says, the warfare against reproductive self-determination for women is being waged both overtly and covertly. In its overt form, poor women are denied abortions because they cannot afford them. 8 out of 10 public hospitals refuse to perform the abortion procedure. Federal and drug company funding for contraception research has plummeted, and a growing right-wing/fundamentalist coalition has mobilized to write embryos and zygotes into the Constitution, and to keep women written out by stopping ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment. So, I don't know why he keeps mentioning that. Like, the Equal Rights Amendment, I think even at this time, this might have been before they added the Hayden rider, right? But most men's rights activists would favor this as well. You'd say, yeah, let's not. And like the reason it fails is because people are afraid of the negative consequences it'll have towards women. So it's literally the opposite. It's not a lack of viewing female personhood. It's actually an overemphasis on the value of female personhood that's caused the ERA to not get passed. Let me see. But yeah, so I'm not exaggerating when I say that literally, in his view, no expense should be spared. No, there's absolutely no expense to be spared in terms of not just providing abortions and making sure women don't have to pay for them, but also research and new methods of abortions too. Like there needs to be federal research, federal funding for these abortions, and the government needs to pay for it. It needs to be in all the public hospitals so that every woman can have an abortion for free and on demand whenever the fuck she wants. And anything short of that is warfare against reproductive self-determination. Does he get to this point under the assumption that all sex is rape? Well, I haven't... So he hasn't stated that as clearly as Dworkin does, because that's Dworkin's famous thing is she says, yeah, all P and V is rape. He basically builds everything centered around that. No, you'll see more of that in the next the last essay we have here, but I mean, you almost need that to be the case if you're going to argue this, right? Because if men and women consent to having sex, obviously they're consenting to, like if it results from a consensual activity, how do we not prescribe any agency to the women at all? Like, it's a good question. Let's see. He talks about how more and more women are deciding to terminate pregnancies. Let me see. I mean, a lot of this I just feel is very irrelevant. But if you want some of these statistics at the time, it's kind of interesting. Let's see. This is a survey of a few hundred men, which that's not even representative. That's like a tiny number. He talks about how they tried to do more education of men to encourage them to use contraception, but that it's not sticking. And this is a point he constantly hammers in on, is that there's a point where they're interviewing men and women about how it is they came to have to consider abortion, and said that it was like 8 out of 10 times they didn't use contraception at all. And what's interesting is that the entire tone of this is chastising men for not doing enough to prevent pregnancies. But then for women, the only option that he sees is abortion. So if women don't use any contraception, that's the men's fault. And then if a woman isn't able to get an abortion, that's also men's fault, right? It's almost like, in his view, the only ethical thing a man can do is to use contraception during sex, or not have any sex that could result in a pregnancy. And then for women, the only ethical thing she can do is to always abort, basically. It's like, it's... Let's see... Okay, so here's where we get back to his like bullshit psychologizing. Men as a class are devoted to the sex act that deposits their semen in a vagina, in situ, as men have so tellingly named their target. And men as a class are firmly attached to the idea that any issue resulting is proof positive they are manly. Men control women's reproductive capacities, in part because men believe that fetuses are phallic, that the ejaculated leavings swelling up in utero. That's not... Leavings? That's not a fucking noun. Is that a noun? Okay, sorry, that's a noun. That the ejaculated leavings swelling up in utero are a symbolic and material extension of the precious penis itself. He does this for, like, rather than using the normal words people would use for basic sexual things, he repackages it in some, like, stupid different way of saying it in order to kind of, like, create this sense of, like, haha, isn't that weird? Isn't it so arbitrary that we think about this way? God, it's just like what he did with the stupid, like, alien... He describes humans as if they were aliens thing in one of the first essays. But women have more options of contraception than men. Exactly. Any option that men forego is an option that the woman also forgoed by definition. And like, it's like the unbeatable argument in the reproductive choice thing, is that even if you made all abortion completely illegal, women still have more reproductive agency than men do. So it's a completely stupid way of framing the argument. Let's see. And like the issue, what's a little bit refreshing about this is that like the abortion debate is really stupid and tiresome, because the pro-life argument, right, is that the fetal babies are like human life, and they're worthy of moral concern. That's the argument. Now, if that argument is invalid or wrong in some way, then that's the end of the conversation, right? If it's not worthy of moral concern, then it's not worthy of moral concern, and that's the end of the argument. Now, if you make the whole pro-choice argument, well, none of those arguments are relevant if the pro-life claim regarding human life in utero, if those claims are accurate, then your argument to pro-choice it's all moot, because there's a second body there that belongs to someone else, right? So the entire pro-choice argument is fundamentally irrelevant, and the only reason it exists is because it's emotionally appealing, because it presents women as victims, and it also presents a narrative for appeasing women, right? And then women, they want they want to be treated special. They want extra things. They want to have more choices rather than fewer choices. So they're going to support it. Obviously, some women don't. I think that women, on average, are... Or no, it's so close, isn't it? It's like super close to 50-50. I think it's like slightly over 50% of men are pro-life, and then slightly over 50% of women are pro-choice, something like that. Like very, very close. But yeah, so anyway, the pro-choice argument is typically very irrelevant. However, what he's arguing is he's actually subverting the pro-life argument by saying that from a male perspective, it's basically all based in male supremacy. Is that it's not that men like love their children or want to have children and reproduce, right? That's not the motivation, or at least insofar as that's the motivation, it's fundamentally based in wanting to perpetuate the patriarchy. And this is a clever novel. It's a kind of it's a novel way of undermining the pro-life position. So I'll give him credit where it's due, because honestly, if you're going to make a pro-choice argument, you have to attack the pro-life position. That's the only way to make the argument. Because making it based on the pro-choice thing, you're just... That's all lies and sophistry. It's an absolutely stupid position. Okay, so this is where he quotes Freud. Where he says, "The wish with which the girl turns to her father, and no doubt originally the wish for the penis which her mother had refused her, and which she now expects from her father. The feminine situation is only established, however, if the wish for a penis is replaced by one for a baby. If, that is, a baby takes the place of a penis in accordance with an ancient symbolic equivalence. Her happiness is great if later on the wish for a baby finds fulfillment in reality, and quite especially so if the baby is a little boy who brings the longed-for penis with him." Right, so that's the whole like penis envy argument. And basically, I guess this is as close as we're getting, right, to an argument for female sexual identity, is that because it's under patriarchy, the little girl has penis envy, and therefore the only way for her to finally achieve that penis is by having a son. But I think he takes issue with this. Yeah, so he's arguing this is like an ancient mythology of the fetus as a penis. Because again, he thinks that personhood is phallocentric, right? So people who don't have penises aren't people in his worldview. And this is also why fetuses, in his view, culturally and mythically, they're presumed male, because that's the hope and the expectation, which... One kind of problematic argument behind this, this was actually something that didn't get mentioned on the Korean feminism stream last week, which is that, well, I guess this week to you guys because you're in the West. It's Sunday here, so for me that's last week already. But he argued, or sorry, there was a statistic that like they favor female babies like 60-something% or whatever, like some like ludicrous imbalanced proportion. Yeah, it's like 65% preference of female compared to 35 for male. And like the only counterexamples we have to that are cultures where the expectation of the male gender role makes it so much more productive to such a degree that like if you're poor and only allowed like one child, having a female child like consigns you to poverty basically. Okay. Let me see. Okay, and then he also makes this argument that like men are they put pressure on women so that they don't choose to have an abortion, and this is also part of patriarchy and part of a system of controlling and dominating women. That because these women are afraid of their partners and afraid of how they're going to react, even if the reaction isn't even like a physical threat, it's just like he'll be sad. He sees this as essentially like an abuse of of that. So if a man has any vested interest whatsoever or any attachment to a potential child he could have, it can't possibly be based on anything virtuous or love or nourishing. It has to be based on his will to continue a legacy of patriarchy. And that if he allows the woman's decision to in any way be affected, right? So should the woman consider what he would prefer at all, then he's oppressing her. Like, let me see. And it was just a study about, like so many of these statistics are completely fucking irrelevant because we have alternative contraceptive methods, and all of the relevant arguments are based in whether or not you think that human life in utero is worthy of human care and concern. That's it. So I don't really need to bother with this, but okay. The other fascinating thing about these essays is that, like, it really is, like, the mask totally coming off. There's no pretension about, like feminists care about men too or anything like that. I just want to read his closing paragraph here. He writes, I believe that men as a class know that reproductive freedom for women is not in men's interest. Men know this in their guts. Men as a class know that if reproductive freedom for women ever became a reality, male supremacy could no longer exist. It's as simple and logical as that. And men's laws, men's dollars, and men's gods serve that knowledge. Men as a class know that their social and cultural and economic advantage over and against women depends absolutely upon the continuance of involuntary pregnancy, involuntary gestation, involuntary parturition, involuntary childbearing. Men know that the very continuity of their gender class, the continuity of masculinity as a direct and imperious gender identity, and the continuity of men as a distinct and imperious power block requires that everyone born without a penis live her whole life palpably circumscribed and controlled by the will of anyone born with a penis. Otherwise, the penis would lose its social meaning as the fundamental determinant of all secular and sacred power. When that happens, when the mere fact of a penis no longer entitles anyone on earth to unjust power over anyone else's life, then, in effect, men will no longer exist. I dare to say I want that future to happen. So, he's defined basically everything that's wrong and evil and bad in the world as male, and says he wants to eradicate men. Now, that doesn't mean he wants people who have penises to no longer exist or no longer be alive, but he wants them to continue to exist, but without a male sexual identity. Because he doesn't want there to be male and female sexual identities. He wants there to be just everyone's fucking gender fluid. And we deconstruct the whole binary. That's literally what that means. So the language sounds more sinister than it actually is, but it's fucking crazy. This reminded me actually of a part that I skipped over in the first essay. And like I mentioned, the first and third essays, they really hang together pretty well. But there was an entire section, actually I don't even need to go to the actual section, I just need to paraphrase it. So when he talks about property and children as an extension of father right and the patriarchal basis of property, his argument, like one of his supporting arguments, is that the kind of work that women do in childbearing and in taking care is custodial work, which is to say, even though it's the mother's child, she doesn't actually own the child. When she's doing things like feeding the child and cleaning up its shit, that's custodial shit work. And this is literally how he's depicting motherhood. Motherhood is shit work. It's custodial shit work. So, from that perspective, you can totally see how he's sitting there like, yeah, if women had all the choices, they would just abort all the babies. Because this is literally how he sees motherhood. It's just nothing but shit work. And the fact that women do that is a reinforcement of the fact that the baby is not really hers, but is actually the father's. it's like it's very very anti-human. This one, I don't know how much detail I need to go over this one. Terrence, I think this one, just based on all of his description of gay porn, maybe this will satisfy the argument that he's a gay man, if that was still something that we needed to prove. This is very similar to the last essay in the first part, where it's kind of like I think a lot of this is very silly, but a person who's like addicted to porn might need this, but he's going to assume that this is like typical of the way sex is defined and characterized. Now, to somebody who is addicted to porn, a lot of the things he describes here might actually have some truth for that person in that scenario. But he's taking this and he's applying it to be like definitive of all sexual male identity, which is, I think, a little bit ridiculous. But basically, the first part of it, he's arguing that this is the personal is political, and that applies to sex. So when people are having sex, the particular sex acts that people engage in have socio-political context. And his argument is that good sex has basically two elements. It has an ethical element and an aesthetic element, which, ooh, he's so close. He's so close to my morality ethics distinction, but swing and a miss. But he argues that ethical sex is sex that should involve like a balance and an equitable relationship between the parties and everything like that. Should be mutual and understanding, and that's all fine. That's all good or whatever. But it seems that he's taking any sex that's even a little bit rough, anything that goes anywhere near anything S&M, any kind of like role play, like all this stuff. He really seems to be arguing that if you engage in any sex that like enforces those kinds of binaries, if your sex isn't like a very perfectly reciprocal, like gender fluidic expression, involving a lot of non-penetrative sex. If it's not that, right? If it's like somewhere kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, then you're reinforcing the notion of male and female as things that are actually real, and therefore this is a form of male supremacy. Which, like, to me that just seems like really goddamn stressful. That like rather than having like a more open attitude towards sex, it's like you have to like analyze every single sex act in a socio-political context, and that to me seems really tiresome, and like I'd rather not bother. Like, just, let's see. Let me see. I basically summarized like all these pages. He like uses a lot of words to say very little. So he starts to criticize the sex-positive movement. He says so-called sexual liberation has not provided a conceptual vocabulary that is very useful for discerning whatever is good about sex, either philosophically or politically. There is a lot of mindless jargon in the air. That sex-positive is good and sex-negative is bad, pro-sex of any kind is good and anti-sex is very bad, combined with a kind of sexual orientation chauvinism. And then later on, let's see. Yeah, so here's talking about sexual orientation, and he actually doesn't like the notion of sexual orientation. He says, ultimately, it is not possible to support one's belief in gender polarity or sex difference without maintaining gender hierarchy, which in our culture is male supremacy. Clinging to sex difference is clinging to male supremacy, and our sexual orientation is one of the ways we've learned to cling. To be oriented toward a particular sex as the object of one's sexual expressivity means, in effect, having a sexuality that is like target practice, keeping it aimed at bodies who display a particular sexual definition above all else, picking out which one to want, which one to get, which one to have. Self-consciousness about one's sexual orientation keeps the issue of gender central at precisely the moment in human experience when gender really needs to become profoundly peripheral. Insistence on having a sexual orientation in sex is about defending the status quo, maintaining sex differences and the sexual hierarchy, whereas resistance to sexual orientation regimentation is more about where we need to be going. So he actually doesn't want a notion of sexual orientation, right? He wants that to be something that's, I guess he doesn't say eradicated, but peripheral, right? And he thinks that when you start with identifying, I guess, what you want, I guess that's too aggressive for him, right? Because then it's too much like hunting. It's too much like you choose a target and go after that target. And like, I wonder what he supposes the alternative is, right? Like that people are just kind of supposed to keep up things, everything open and fluid, and like if anybody targets in or gravitates too much towards what they like, are they then expressing too much of a targeted sexual identity? They're too oriented? They have to like be less enthusiastic and sort of like accidentally kind of happen upon certain things, or it's a very novel way of kind of looking at things. I don't know. Let's see. I don't think there's anything else. Yeah, but the argument is that if you have an orientation, you have a target. The target is objectified. That's kind of what it boils down to. Then in part 4, he talks about the commercial representations of sex, which he means pornography. And essentially what he does is he argues that in porn, the things that they're trying to express are things that you can't, they're sort of intangible, and when you have to express them in like a visual pornographic form, like it doesn't translate that well. And basically he believes that porn becomes like the definitive thing that defines what good sex is, and then therefore a lot of people, when they're having sex, they're actually kind of functioning as more of like a camera, and they're doing things that basically are supposed to work in the context of a porn, and then because of that they're not actually in the moment. And again, this one, it's kind of similar territory as like the end of the last essay, where he talks about how like even looking at like a pornographic picture, if somebody is fantasizing about that while they're having sex, there's a form of alienation there, which parallels the alienation of people who are like acting out sexual things, and then having objects produced from that, right? And it's, so again, this is a lot of the anti-porn kind of rant, but then he goes into depth about the typical gay male sex film and how it's not realistic, which, I mean, a lot of this just hinges upon the degree to which he thinks this is a realistic depiction of the way that sex works, and a realistic expectation imparted in within each individual person. And basically, because he's a hardcore social constructivist, he needs porn to defend all of the social expectations of sex. So I don't, and he doesn't give us any indication. He doesn't give us any like actual evidence that suggests the degree to which this actually does map onto this. So this is why I said, you could show this to somebody who is like addicted to porn, and they might get something kind of useful out of it. But that's a targeted issue. And I'm kind of suspecting here that John Stoltenberg, that he has this kind of an attitude that's very, very like porn centric, and that he's had maybe a lot of sex that was a little bit too rapey for his taste, And his way of coping with that experience is to say that, oh, this is what society taught everyone to do and taught myself to do, and that's why I did that or had that done to me. And if only all of society would just take the radical feminist pill, then this would never happen again. Rather than like taking responsibility for his own actions and being the change he wants to see in the world, he's doing the classic male feminist thing, which is to project his own violent, rapey tendencies onto all other men, such that he can be the hashtag trademark one good male, one good man, on top of the on top of the hierarchy. Let me see how much of this is left here. Yeah, I don't know. He also has the quote in here from, was it Robin Morgan? I forget exactly who. The argument is that porn tells lies about women and the truth about men. Ugh. I don't know if there's anything else that's worth going over in here. The values in the sex that is depicted in gay male sex films are very much the values in the sex that gay men tend to have. They are very much the values in the sex that straight men tend to have. They are very much the values that male supremacists tend to have. Taking, using, estranging, dominating. Essentially, sexual power-mongering. Many men consume sex films and videos because watching these media makes them feel like having sex when they don't particularly feel like having sex. And men don't like the feeling of not feeling like having sex. I don't know. Do you guys think that's true? Do you guys think that, like if you... How about this? Okay, you got 2 pills. Would you prefer to take the horny pill, where you're constantly horny, always thinking about sex, or the asexual pill, where you're just no longer interested in sex ever again? If I give you those 2 pills, which one would you take? Like, would anybody actually prefer to always be horny? I feel like that would be a fucking curse. That would be like terrible. Like, I don't buy this at all. And like the idea that he just throws this out there as though that's true, I think he's telling us more about himself than about anything else. There's a fairly common compulsion among men to feel they shouldn't feel like having sex even when they don't. It's as if men don't really feel their male identity unless they're experiencing their own body in a way that is explicitly, culturally, sexually phallic. Right? Like, this is just, to me, it's absolutely bizarre. But, again, he hasn't acknowledged anything good or virtuous in male sexual identity. So, like, to him, anything that males produce or have created or done that's good, that's invisible to him. That's just taken for granted. So he doesn't perceive of male sexual identity being anything but being erect and fucking something. And it's like, yeah, I guess if the entire redeeming virtue of an entire fucking gender class was supposed to be expressed in fucking, yeah, I guess, yeah, you know, the disadvantages are going to outweigh the advantages if that's what you're going to limit all of your positive part of the T-chart to. Commercial representations of sex help men over those unpleasant little hurdles when their sexual apparatus is not especially raring to go. You know what I mean? Like this is the writings of someone who's sex addicted. What about sexual transmutation? I don't know what that means. Like being a tranny? I don't know what transmutation means in that context. Transmutation sounds like it should be about cars. Okay, then in part 5, it was titled, How Can Anyone Ever Learn What Good Sex Really Is If They Haven't Ever Had It? At this point, aficionados of pornography will perhaps protest, but sex films are still emerging as a communications medium, and they have yet to reach their full artistic potential. So of course the sex films need to be improved, with enhanced production values, more believable storylines, upgraded acting, better lighting. The solution, some will say, is to change the way that sex films are made. Frankly, I don't think that will do. The solution, I believe, is really to change the way that sex is had. Here's what I mean. Let's assume that there exists an authentic erotic potential between humans such that mutuality, reciprocity, fairness, deep communion, and affection, total body integrity for both partners, and equal capacity for choice-making and decision-making are merged with robust physical pleasure, intense sensation, and brimming over expressiveness. Let's say that some people have actually already experienced that erotic potential and some people have never. Let's say, further, that the experience of this erotic potential occurred quite against the odds, because given the prevailing social values about sex, it could not have been predicted that two people would ever find out that this erotic potential exists. Everything about the cultural context would seem to predict that sexual meetings would be tainted with or steeped in shame and guilt, hierarchy and domination, contempt and repulsion, objectification and alienation, sexually crippling incidents from childhood, or simply emotional absence from each other. But as luck would have it, a few folks happen upon an erotic potential that is actually rooted in the same values that bring kindness and exuberance and intimacy to the rest of their life. So then, the question becomes, how does anyone pass along their knowledge of that potential to other folks on the planet? How do they express it, show it, communicate it without having to sleep with everyone? Some cultural artifacts will of course be necessary to get the word out, to attempt to convey to people what can be good about sex and to help people disentangle their sexual histories from the social norms that keep sex from being good. There will need to be expressions in the form of many kinds of messages, words, pictures, performances, combinations. Information will need to be shared, but I imagine that this communication would be very different from most sexually explicit media that now exist, which are essentially things made for consumers to have a sexual relationship to. The whole point of communicating about this human erotic possibility is that people be whole people to one another, not parts, not things, not objects, not consumables. Obviously, then, the media appropriate to such communication cannot itself be produced and marketed as things to have sex with, as orgasm totems, which would merely reinforce sexual relating to people as things. But the human connection has to begin among us. The human communication cannot wait to be mediated. What I believe needs to happen is a radical re-examination of the values and the kinds of sex we are having. We need to make a commitment to responsibility and responsiveness in sex. We need to make a personal commitment to stay conscious during sex, to stay alert to what is going on even as it is going on, a commitment to being ethically awake instead of doped. As individuals and perhaps as friends, I don't believe there is any readiness for this in any existing movement. We need to begin to understand more about what is going on between us when we have sex, the values in it, how it is related to the rest of our lives, how it is related to how we treat people, and how it is related to political change. And we need to talk about it all face-to-face, one-to-one, before, during, and after. Our bodies have learned many lies. If we dare to be ruthlessly honest, we can perhaps recover truth. So, I don't know. In that last page there, I feel like I have to read it because I'm not sure how to even paraphrase that. I don't think he said anything necessarily bad there, right? I think that's all good and fine, but it seems to be a false dichotomy. It seems to be that there's a lot of sex acts that he's saying are absolutely bad, can't be done. They all reinforce male supremacy and the patriarchy, and if we just got rid of all those kinds of sex and then only had the kinds of sex that he approves of, then, I don't know, we'd all have our gender fluid polygamous orgies or whatever. I don't know. It's hard to disagree with that because he didn't state anything concrete, right? He just said all of that was very abstract, and I think a lot of people who have the kinds of sex that he disapproves of would maintain that their sex checks all those boxes anyway. And I would suspect that it's an individualized thing enough that there's going to be plenty of counterexamples such that a lot of that is kind of a non-statement. I don't know. So anyway, that's how that part ends. In part 3, he talks about pornography, and this is where he goes like full Dworkin. So it's it's a really the audio of it is really funny to listen to in a robot voice. But a lot of it's legal. A lot of it is like a potential law put forward by anti-porn radical feminist activists. So that's a little bit more kind of dry and technical. But I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in it. But yeah, it'll actually probably take a little bit of research because I don't know, like it's very very legal centric, a lot of it, and I'm sure that this is probably going to be the part where as I'm going through it, there's going to be a lot of things that I might miss. So this might be a part that when I do part 5 that I might have to be like revisiting and kind of patching up a few things. But anyway, that was all I had, I think, for this section. I'm just going to look over my notes. Was there anything I really missed? Yeah, I think that was about it. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, that's I think I covered pretty much everything in part 2 pretty well. So I thought this was a pretty interesting section. But yeah, so male sexual identity is I guess the origin of it is male insecurity, and it's reproduced through domestic violence, and then it leads to war, which is stockpiling cock power as a deterrent, which is merely a euphemism for sadism, and creates a meta-patriarchy of superfathers who send their sons off to die in war, which requires women to step up and be the backbone of society because they're filling the male role, which I guess was not the backbone of society when men were doing it, but then when women are doing it, now it's the backbone of society. And let's be clear, what women were doing beforehand, which is custodial work of children, that was just shit work. So being a mother means nothing. And what else? Fetuses are penises, and therefore the pro-life position is really just about protecting penises. And if we were to legalize abortion, then it would overthrow the patriarchy, and we'd have like the radical feminist utopia that he dreams of. Also, we need to get rid of all penetrative sex and all sex with any political or sociological implication whatsoever. And don't do drugs. Don't do drugs when you have sex. And porn is bad. I guess that's about it.